Hey guys, welcome back for another fun and cutie tutorial. This time we're going to illustrate the cutest cutie of them all, Baby Yoda. As always, this will be super easy, so grab your pencil and let's start. By the way, this little guy is Worfy. He is my new kitten and named after Worf from Star Trek. I got him at the same time as Cutie, which means miracle in Chinese. They're best friends and their cuteness is too much sometimes. Just too cute. Okay, back to drawing Baby Yoda. All the specific supplies I'm using are linked below, but like always, when you sketch, be sure to use a light pencil or a light hand. Start with a simple rectangle for the head. Now draw a slightly rounded out rectangle that's wider on the bottom for the body. I will decide to make it even shorter later on in the video because the bigger the head and the smaller the body, the cuter he will be. This is one of my rules for cuteness, so the proportions are up to you. Next, we draw two slightly angled lines from the corners of the top of the rectangle. These are his ears, and you can make them shorter or longer if you want to tweak the look. The next step is two half circles at the bottom of the rectangle for cheeks. Next, we go from the center of the circles to the end of the lines to finish off the ear shape. My sketch looked a little bit off, so I checked with my pencil by just putting my finger on it and measuring both sides, and this confirmed the difference. I simply erased and redrew it. This is why sketching with a light pencil is so important to start any illustration. Now for the top of his head, we will draw a triangle coming out of the rectangle's edges. This is a short and squished one. It's meant to be really subtle. It also meets right in the center, and if you can't tell where that is, just draw a line dividing his body for guidance. The rough frame using simple shapes is done, and now we can begin sketching details. I use a simple slightly rounded line from the top of the half circle and a little half circle inside to add detail to the ears. Then I flesh out the ears some more with simple curved lines. It's similar on top and bottom, and notice how I made it more rounded at the edges to get rid of the sharp point. Sharp points are not as cute as rounded points. I'm also crossing the face to symbolize where the eyes will go. I also draw a squished rounded rectangle similar to the body for the arms. And this is when I decided that his body was too tall, so I made it shorter by raising up the bottom. I added one more line to symbolize his sleeves and put his tiny hands into the rectangle. Then using simple rectangles, I mark out the details of his outfit and add a little oval for a zipper. For his eyes, we're simply adding slightly angled oval shapes. If it's hard to make them equal, draw more lines as guides. If you want a simpler look, you can always use simple dots for eyes like I usually do in my other work. I just thought Baby Yoda's trademark are his huge alien eyes. He has a simple button nose and a cutie smile. You can play with his face expression just by changing his mouth, and I encourage you to pick something fun. I used 3 simple lines on his head to symbolize his hairiness, and then refined the eyes to be more of an almond shape. If you're not sure how to do his eyes, he cut a scrap piece of paper and practice on there first. You can vary it as much as you want, but be sure to make them as symmetrical as you can. They don't have to be perfect though, as you will see. And now it's time to ink. You can use whatever medium you like, but ink is my favorite for outlines. I start with the eyes since they're the hardest, and right off the bat, I made the left eye too small compared to the right eye. But that's okay since I can just go back in and add more bulk to it since they'll be black anyway. As you can see, I was having trouble with the eyes. In fact, I made a lot of overall mistakes while making this cutie, but the moral of the story is to push through even if it feels like you can't draw anything today. If I'd have given up, this tutorial wouldn't exist. It's okay to be rusty sometimes, and it's okay to make mistakes. Now you can play with the shapes you use for highlights, but I did an upside down sideways teardrop, 2 ovals, and a little diamond. If you have some sort of white you can use on top, don't be afraid to fill the whole thing in or make mistakes, because you can always add it later. But if you don't, you have to do what I'm doing here, which is negative space drawing. And if it scares you to go directly with ink, make sure to sketch it out first and then use the ink. Now I'll show you guys a fun little trick for more dimension in his eyes. I take a dark brown pencil and fill in where I want my highlight, which is the bottom half of the eyes, like a little circular shape. Then I fill in the rest with ink. Notice how I make little circles in the middle for the pupil. Then I take the darker brown pencil and sketch with it where the black touches the brown to make the transition more gradual. This makes the effect super subtle and adds a nice gradient. His eyes are done, and notice how they're not perfectly symmetrical, but it gives him a charming effect. Now since I did the hardest part, I go in and outline the rest of him. I don't let my lines touch all the way for a fun look, and to add texture to the collar of his jacket, I made it feel more fluffy with how I outlined it, like a puffy little cloud. I continue inking all around and throw in some details like the wrinkles in his dress and 2 little lines for the wrinkles on his forehead. Remember to keep it simple, because the simpler it is, the cuter it will be. This is another rule of cuteness. Complexity can make things look older and not as cute, so always simplify and add less when in doubt. You can find all my rules for cuteness in my You Can Draw Cute Animals class, and I'll leave a link to it below. Once I'm done inking, I erase the pencil lines and it's time to color him. Like I said before, use whatever medium you like, but for my fun style, I recently got into using colored pencils above or below watercolors to give it an extra pop of texture. I add some pink into his cheeks, ears, and nose, then I use red lightly to increase the contrast and make a subtle gradient. I outline his cutie eyes in green and add little bits of it all around to make texture and slight shading. Then I use brown the same way in his coat and beige in the collar. For the final touch, I use a gray pencil to add slight shadow, and now it's time to paint him. I will go through my process, but if you get confused or don't know how to use watercolor but want to learn, check out my class Anyone Can Watercolor to learn all the basics. I'll leave a link to this also below. To start, I mix yellow with my yellowish green to make a neon green color and drop it into the center of his face and ears. Then I pick up a more bright foresty green and fill it in the rest of him. Since the paint is still wet, it blends nicely with the other colors. I add more concentrated bursts of green to give a subtle shadow at the edges. And then I pick up a reddish pink and paint his ears, cheeks, and nose. If your paints get muddy like this, just pick up the excess paint with a dry brush. This is normal since red and green are complementary colors. I paint his coat using the same technique of mixing two different but similar browns, and then use less water and more paint in the fluffy part to add some color, and then go in with plain water to dissolve it, but it leaves from the previous lines, which makes a cool texture for a subtle effect. I used blue and a tiny bit of brown to add color to the shadow, but I didn't like the blue, so I later changed it to just brown. The background is made up of loose brush strokes and using the same neon green as in his face with lots of yellow. I let the colors do their own thing with wet and wet technique, and they will make awesome textures where there's pools of water once dry. I used a small piece of paper towel to cover up his face and then tap the brush lightly on my finger for a splatter effect. Then I add some concentrated bursts of foresty green to add even more color. Since my layer is still wet, it blends beautifully and makes it look like he's standing in foliage with a bokeh effect. I use a mini hot air gun to dry him, and oh my god, this thing is awesome. I used to have a hair dryer that I used, but it took way longer and the paint moved a lot more. Once I tried this thing, it blew my mind. I mean, I knew they were around, but I just never tried it. If you don't have one, I'd invest in one. I got this one for only $12 on Amazon and wish I'd gotten it sooner. The only thing is the cord is a little short with the one I got, so I can't recommend it. But still, it works flawlessly. Okay, back to the baby. I add little white dots with my white gel pen for my signature style and fix up the highlights in his eyes while I'm at it. You can also do this with white gouache or acrylic or Posca markers or anything that can be opaque over watercolor. With a few more well-placed highlights and dots, I am done. Little Yoda turned out super adorable, in fact too cute. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and have painted a little cutie of your own. If not, be sure to give it a try. If you are afraid to fail, you have already failed, and if you try and fail, you will learn. But I think you can surprise yourself and do this. Just take your time. As always, stay awesome, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. May the force be with you, my friends.